As a game designer, I quite often get asked to talk about role-playing games, about what's so appealing about them, how do you play them, things like that. So I thought I might start a little mini-series on role-playing games, what is so appealing about them, how to play them, and so on. So you have to start with what is perhaps one of the most difficult questions about role-playing games, and that is, what are they and how do you play? Well, it's such a wide plethora of different games that can be called role-playing games that there is no definitive answer. But for now, I'll stick with the traditional role-playing games. So what they really are in essence is that they are a shared story between a number of players, between one and however many, and the games master, who is sort of like the narrator or the author. They moderate what you do, they look after the rules, they spin the story that you go through, but they're not telling a story. Rather, they're creating a context or a series of encounters or scenes in which your character's actions and the actions of other characters will determine the story and what happens. So, for example, you might be faced with a situation. Say that you're somewhere deep in the bowels of a dungeon underneath a ruined castle. You open the door, slowly. Your torchlight reveals a small chamber, little more than a cell. Within it lies a chest, partially rotten, the iron bindings rusted. The whole place reeks of damp wood. And squatting next to the chest, apparently defending it, is a goblin in a sackcloth loincloth wielding a rusty, dirty-looking dagger. What do you do? And that what do you do is the essence of role-playing. It's that forms the conversation between the narrator, the games master, and the players. What do you do? I do this. This happens. Now what do you do? And so on. And that forms a cycle of gameplay. And between you that weaves a story. Now to an onlooker, this can seem to be quite boring. Though plenty of people are now watching games unfold on Twitch or other live streaming services. But while you're in there, in the moment, it isn't. You are invested in your character, you have built your character to do certain things. And so to you in the moment, and in the interplay and banter between you and the other players, it's much more interesting and much more engaging. Now you may have role-played in online multiplayer games, or you may have had cybersex or something else. These are all essentially role-playing actions where what happens is negotiated with the other person. But in most of these interactions, rules aren't really there. Perhaps in an MMO, if you get into a duel with another player, then the game's mechanics, the computers will determine the outcome. But when it comes to tabletop games, when you're playing with people, whether it's over the internet or face to face, what you do has to be moderated and understood. A lot of the actions that you make will just be simple declarations. I open the door. Provided there's nothing in the way, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to open the door. So the games master will tell you that you open the door and describe what lies on the other side, as I just did. But sometimes actions are more chancy or depend upon a certain level of skill or knowledge. A magic user, a magician, sorcerer might have to decode some runes, in which case you'd better hope that you know that language, or that you're good enough at deciphering codes that you can work out what it means, and so on. If that door is locked and you need to pick it, you've got a chance of doing so. And in most games this is moderated using rules and using dice. So the dice provide a random number, an assortment of random numbers, and then your character's statistics, their skills, how dexterous they are in the case of the lock, whatever, determine how likely, in combination with the randomization, you are to be able to do it. So you might have a 50% chance to pick the lock. You might have a 25% chance to pick the lock. You roll the dice and you determine what happens. That also is used to determine what happens as a result in combat, which is usually divided into turns, and the ebb and flow of combat proceeds that way. So creating your character is important, deciding what you want to be good at, what you're willing to not be so good at. A synergy between you and the other players in your team so that you have overlapping areas of expertise, but things that particular characters are good at, so that as a whole you can take on whatever the game world happens to throw at you. Now, fantasy isn't the only genre. There's science fiction, there's horror, there's even romance games, there's games of all kinds. It doesn't have to be your stereotypical wizard, thief and priest, whatever, knight or whatever, delving into a dungeon. It can be space battles, it can be psychics on the run from the government, it can be conspiracies, it can be alien invasions, it can be being stalked by a killer with a machete, it can be all of these things. And in the moment it can be very engaging and very immersive, especially if you are invested in your character. And if you're going to play, you're going to need a character. Different games have different rules and so on, but there are some universals. Your first few characters, you're likely to make up something, but to act as yourself. What would you do in that situation? From there, maybe you can graduate to exaggerating aspects of yourself, playing something that is an aspiration of yours, or an indulgence of something that you would like to do but don't. You might play a character who is a heartless murderer or completely mercantile. Possibilities are endless, but then later on you might graduate and you might start to play characters who are very different to yourself, putting yourself in other people's shoes, trying to make decisions based upon what they would do rather than what you would do, because many of the decisions and choices that your characters will be faced with won't be, do I stab the goblin or hit him with my axe? You know, they can be, do I help this particular village over that village? Do I owe my loyalty to the king or to the people? Moral choices come in. So when you play someone completely different to yourself, it can be useful to come up with a backstory and to decide how those things influence their choices going forward, just as things in your own life will influence choices you make. And that is the point, I think, at which games become really interesting, really immersive and really engaging, that projecting yourself into the choices of someone else in fantastical settings and so on, and enjoying their stories, becoming them, rather than being yourself. This breadth, both in the characters that you can play, the worlds in which you can inhabit, the things that you can do, these are what still make tabletop games, at least in these arenas, superior to computerized role-playing games, where choices are limited, where moral choices are often limited to, do I murder this sack of kittens or save this busload of nuns? You know, they're often very simplistic, dualistic, and often constricted. And it takes a lot of work in many of these games to provide the scope of choice, even a fraction of the scope of choice that you have in a tabletop game. I mean, Fallout has narrowed it down from earlier incarnations, and more effort has been put into graphics in the world, and that is all well and good, but it takes away those role-playing options, those meaningful choices, those different ways to approach the game. And even at its height, those choices were nothing compared to what could happen in a role-playing game. And if you're confronted with this goblin in a cell, you could attack, you could retreat, you could try to talk him down, you could try to feed him some drugged food, you could try to persuade him, befriend him, you could charm him with magic to turn him into an ally, you could interrogate him, you could masquerade as his leaders. There's endless approaches to issues, not just a single fork or an either or. That is what really elevates role-playing games. I think, and the human capacity for invention, if you have a good games master who can come up with things on the fly, adjust adventures and scenarios and narratives, and give you something new and different and adaptable in a way that computers simply can't. Plus it gives you a degree of socialization with friends, face to face or online, and encourages you to keep that going. And that's something that I think that has begun to disappear from our lives. And I'm not old-fashioned to the degree that I necessarily think that's some great evil, but it is nice to be able to schedule to meet your friends, to have an activity, something you can do and enjoy, and do with people face to face. You know, eat food together, play games together, and be together. And it gives you stories that can last a lifetime. Bang. Postmortem Studios is my personal imprint where I create role-playing games, stories, card games, board games, and more. You can get them at RPG Now, DriveThruRPG, Lulu.com, and some on Amazon. Role-playing games to die for.
Women are just wrong mate. We'll give me just one more drink. What